If the Germans hit again, we lose the line. The room stayed silent. Maps covered nearly the entire table. Colored markers stretched across Alsace toward the Rhine, while cigarette smoke drifted slowly beneath the ceiling lights. Outside, January rain mixed with melting snow against the windows of Allied headquarters. Then someone finally asked, "So what's the alternative?" Dwight D. Eisenhower looked down at the map for another second before answering. "Then we leave Strasbourg." Nobody answered immediately. Several officers stopped writing. January 1945. Across Alsace, the snow had already turned dark from tank movement, artillery smoke, and weeks of continuous traffic moving toward the front. Only weeks earlier, the Battle of the Bulge had nearly torn the Allied line apart before many commanders fully understood the scale of the German attack. Entire sectors collapsed under pressure, while fuel convoys and reinforcements struggled to reach the front through frozen roads and winter fog. Now another German offensive was building again. Not in Belgium this time. Further south, German forces had launched Operation Nordwind into Alsace. American divisions pulled out of the Ardennes. Fighting barely had time to regroup before being pushed back toward the line again. Ambulance headlights moved slowly through frozen roads at night, while artillery continued landing across towns behind the sector. Traffic controllers waved stalled fuel trucks aside as fresh infantry units kept moving toward the front in darkness and snow. Inside headquarters, Eisenhower studied the situation and saw the same warning signs returning. Weak reserves. Exposed positions. A front stretched too far forward near the Rhine, and Strasbourg sitting dangerously close to it. Militarily, the city looked increasingly difficult to defend if the Germans broke through again. That was the problem. Because politically, Strasbourg was almost impossible to abandon. French forces had only recently liberated the city after years of German occupation. Crowds had filled the streets when French troops entered it. Flags returned to government buildings. Church bells rang across the city during the liberation celebrations. If Allied forces withdrew now and German troops entered Strasbourg again, it would not look like a temporary military adjustment. It would look like France had lost the city twice. Inside Allied headquarters, officers understood immediately what Eisenhower's proposal actually meant. Not just retreat. Humiliation. And the worst part was, Eisenhower's logic made sense. That was what made the atmosphere inside the room so dangerous, because now the question was no longer whether Strasbourg mattered. Everyone already understood that. The question was whether Eisenhower would abandon it anyway. The reaction from the French came almost immediately. Before formal withdrawal orders had even been finalized, word was already moving through Allied headquarters that Dwight D. Eisenhower was considering pulling forces back from Strasbourg. And in Paris, the idea landed like a shockwave, because Strasbourg was never just another city to the French. Only weeks earlier, French troops had marched into it after years of German occupation. Crowds packed the streets during the liberation. Flags appeared from apartment windows overlooking the squares, while church bells rang across the city as armored vehicles rolled through the center. For many in France, Strasbourg was not simply territory recovered from Germany. It was proof that France itself had returned. Now Allied commanders were discussing whether they might abandon it again before winter had even ended. To Charles de Gaulle, the idea felt politically catastrophic before a single order had even been signed. At the front, the pressure looked even worse. German attacks during Operation Nordwind continued hammering the Alsace sector day and night. Frozen roads behind the line clogged with artillery tractors, ambulances, and fuel convoys trying to move through darkness and snow. In some areas, traffic barely advanced for hours after nightfall. Exhausted American infantry units who had survived the Ardennes fighting were being pushed back into combat before replacement equipment had fully arrived. And beneath all of it, the same fear kept spreading through the alliance. Another breakthrough. Eisenhower had seen what happened when warnings were ignored. He refused to make that mistake twice. That was what made the arguments inside Allied Command so difficult to contain. Because Eisenhower's reasoning did not sound reckless. It sounded frighteningly reasonable. And the French understood that too. That was why the resistance hardened so quickly. Inside headquarters, conversations became sharper with every passing hour. Officers leaned across maps calculating withdrawal distances, while others argued over what abandoning Strasbourg would do to France politically if German troops entered the city again. Some commanders discussed evacuation routes quietly. Others stopped mentioning withdrawal at all once French officers entered the room. Meanwhile, Jacob L. Devers found himself trapped between both pressures at once. If the Germans broke through, his sector would absorb the collapse. But if Strasbourg was abandoned without a fight, the political damage could spread far beyond Alsace. Every hour made the atmosphere worse. German artillery still landed across towns behind the sector. Ambulance crews continued moving through frozen roads after dark, while engineers worked constantly to keep supply routes open through ice and wreckage. Rumors spread faster through headquarters than official orders. Officers lowered their voices when discussing Strasbourg openly. And slowly, beneath the strategy meetings and military calculations, another fear started forming inside the alliance itself. If Eisenhower finally ordered Strasbourg abandoned, would the French actually obey him? The confrontation everyone expected never fully came. No shouting across headquarters corridors. No commander openly refusing orders. No dramatic split inside the alliance. It became colder than that. By mid-January 1945, Operation Nordwind was still hammering the Alsace sector. German artillery continued striking frozen roads and villages day after day, while fuel convoys crawled through snow behind the front. Infantry units dug into frozen ground at night, listening for vehicle movement beyond the tree lines. In some sectors, attacks came before dawn, often enough that exhausted soldiers stopped fully unpacking equipment between engagements. Eisenhower still remembered what a stabilized line had looked like 3 weeks before the Bulge, and for a time, the situation in Alsace still looked fragile enough to justify retreat. That was what made the atmosphere inside headquarters so tense, because nobody could fully prove Eisenhower was wrong. But now the pressure coming from the French had started changing shape completely. At first, the arguments centered on symbolism. Now they centered on consequences. Jean de Lattre de Tassigny and French commanders understood that if Strasbourg was abandoned after being liberated only weeks earlier, the political damage could survive long after the war itself ended. Pressure intensified from Paris. Messages moved constantly between military headquarters and political officials. Officers who had once treated withdrawal as a realistic precaution now hesitated before openly supporting it in meetings. And slowly, almost without anyone formally admitting it, the balance inside the alliance began shifting. Not because Eisenhower suddenly changed his position, because the battlefield itself began changing first. German attacks started losing momentum across the sector. American and French resistance hardened around key positions, while artillery and reinforcements arrived more consistently behind the line. Roads that had recently carried retreat fears now carried fresh troops and ammunition forward instead. The front still looked dangerous, but it no longer looked like collapse. That changed the meaning of the entire decision. Now abandoning Strasbourg no longer felt like emergency caution. Now it risked looking like surrendering a city that might actually survive. And once that shift happened, the political pressure became almost impossible to reverse. Inside headquarters, fewer officers openly discussed evacuation routes. Conversations that had once focused on withdrawal distances slowly turned toward reinforcing defensive positions instead. The possibility of retreat still existed on paper, but now it carried a completely different risk. Not disaster at the front, disaster inside the alliance itself. Quietly, without any dramatic confrontation ever taking place, Allied command crossed the point where Strasbourg would remain defended. And Eisenhower understood something uncomfortable the moment that happened. If the Germans broke through after this decision, the responsibility would still land on him. The Germans never retook Strasbourg. As January 1945 dragged deeper into winter, Operation Nordwind slowly began losing momentum across Alsace. The attacks that had terrified Allied headquarters only weeks earlier weakened under constant resistance. American and French units held defensive positions through frozen forests, shattered villages, and artillery strikes that still continued long after dark. Little by little, the fear surrounding Strasbourg began fading. The city stayed in Allied hands. Across France, the outcome immediately became political. Newspapers celebrated Strasbourg as proof that liberation had survived direct German pressure. French flags remained over government buildings that only months earlier had stood under occupation. For Charles de Gaulle, the symbolism mattered far beyond Alsace itself. France had not lost Strasbourg again, and that mattered enormously after years of defeat, occupation, and humiliation. But inside Allied headquarters, the memory of the crisis settled differently. Because privately, many officers understood something uncomfortable. Dwight D. Eisenhower's fears had never been irrational. Only weeks earlier, the Battle of the Bulge had nearly shattered the Allied front, before commanders fully understood the scale of the German attack. Supply shortages still disrupted movement across major sectors. Winter weather slowed reinforcements constantly. And during the worst days of Nordwind, the Alsace front had looked unstable enough that another breakthrough no longer felt impossible. That uncertainty never fully disappeared afterward, even after Strasbourg survived. Late at night, headquarters lights often remained on long after meetings ended, while movement markers continued shifting across maps of the Rhine front. Staff officers prepared for new crises before the previous ones had fully settled. Convoys still pushed through snow-covered roads toward the east, while artillery flashes continued appearing beyond distant villages after dark. The pressure had eased, but nobody inside Allied command believed it was over yet. And maybe that was the real legacy of Strasbourg. Not a dramatic mutiny inside the alliance, not some final collapse between Allied commanders. Something quieter than that. A moment where military logic and political reality pulled in opposite directions hard enough for everyone inside the coalition to feel it. Because by 1945, the alliance was no longer being held together by trust alone. Too much pressure had already passed through it for that. Now it was being held together by necessity. And for a few frozen weeks in Alsace, some Allied commanders quietly realized something they would probably never admit publicly again. Winning the war together was not the same thing as trusting each other anymore.